Aloha and welcome to the monthly show, Maunalua, Past, Present, and Future. My name is Mardi LaPrade, and our special guest today is Dr. Charles Van Rees, the Ecology Advisor for the Livable Hawaii Kai Hui. He is here this week to help celebrate World Wetlands Day. The theme of this special day is Wetland Biodiversity, Why It Matters. Dr. Van Rees, before we talk about biodiversity, would you please explain what a wetland is?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me back on the show. It's nice to be back and great to be chatting with you again. So wetland ecosystems really are a broad umbrella, and the best way to sort of pick them out from other types of natural environments we might encounter are that you typically need some coincidence of fresh water, usually, and land, wetlands. So you're looking for some place where land and water are coming together in some way. Freshwater wetlands are the main thing that we're going to be talking about, but there are, of course, also saltwater wetlands. So some legal jurisdictions consider coral reefs a type of wetland.
Nice.
And salt marshes, where I'm from on the east coast of the U.S., is another good example. But freshwater wetlands, which is what we're focusing on today, are things like streams, rivers, lakes, and ponds, and what I focus on in my research, which would be what they call palustrine wetlands, which are marshes and swamps and things like that, places where water's sitting on the land.
So then, what exactly is biodiversity?
And this is one of my favorite, probably, topics out there to study, and of course this is one of the main things I sort of based my career on as an ecologist, but biodiversity is essentially all the variety you can find in life, in life on the planet. So this is different types of species, different life forms within species, different ecosystems, different larger taxonomic groups like families or phyla, also genetic diversity, so differences within a species. You know, people who look different than each other, that's biodiversity. You know, you and I are different people, we are different forms of life. So biodiversity encompasses everything different you can find in a living world.
Then, are there different kinds of biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes from diversity at the genetic level, which again could be within species or even within individual family groups, to also diversity in functions. So what those species do in the ecosystem, that's a different form of biodiversity that's very important, because you need lots of different functions and also sometimes redundant or repetitive functions to reinforce different roles in the ecosystem. And so people have found that there's a very strong connection between the diversity of things you have going on in the ecosystem and how healthy that ecosystem is and how stable it is at doing certain functions.
So if we're going to understand this, you must have ways of measuring biodiversity. How do you do that?
And there are lots of different ways, and it all depends on what aspect of biodiversity you want to study. And so of course we've talked about there are so many different ways that things can be different in the biological world. And some of the most basic ways to study biodiversity would be things like what they call species richness, which is, let's say we're thinking about bugs. You go over to a pond maybe and run a net through it and take all the bugs out that you catch, and you count how many different kinds there are. You sort them all into different piles. That would be richness. How many different species do I find? But there's also different metrics having to do with how even the distribution of abundance is between those species. Again, you can also be keeping track of things like how many different functions there are. So even if there are a ton of species, if they all perform the same function in an ecosystem, maybe it's not that functionally diverse, right? Also looking at different kinds of habitats. Is there a lot of diversity in the space and not just the animals that are there, or is it all kind of the same thing over and over again? So.
I see. Well, it's all very fascinating, but why should we humans care about biodiversity?
Now that is a really good question, and honestly one that I get all of the time, and I never get tired of answering it because I think it's so important for us to consider. You know, I think nowadays it's very hard for people to connect to biodiversity and understand why it's relevant to their lives. You know, people would rather go watch Netflix than care about what's going on in the park outside or at some fancy wetland in their neighborhood, whatever it is. So this gets back to the functional elements we were talking about, where ecosystems and the natural world in general performs what are called, or what are known as, ecosystem services, which are things that nature does for us. And if you look up that term on the internet, ecosystem services are a really, really big deal. I mean, we are talking, if we estimate their economic value of the world and its natural ecosystems, what they do for us, those values are in the trillions of dollars per year. I mean, this is how we survive on this planet. It's because these living systems are sustaining us. And there are tons of different forms of ecosystem services, really, really diverse. So these go from things like what they call provisioning services, which is when that ecosystem is sort of giving or providing you something, like maybe it's helping fresh water be provided to you, or it's providing fish that you can eat. There are regulating services, which are perhaps the way that forests might prevent floods from happening. They're regulating the water. Cultural services, if you identify emotionally and spiritually with a part of nature, that's a service. It's doing something for your identity, your sense of self. So there are all these different forms of ecosystem services, and there's a very strong link, like I mentioned before, between the health and the functioning of these ecosystems, how well they give us these services, and how biodiverse they are. And if we start to lose that variation, all those rich differences, we lose the services. And so why we should care? There are way more reasons that I could list out. Any of these things we value, having clean air to breathe, having water to drink, having animals that are the basis of our culture, all of those are ecosystem services, and all of those are thanks to biodiversity. And as we erode that biodiversity, those services become more and more tenuous. And we're getting closer and closer to losing them. And of course, that's dangerous. We can't replicate those things. It's very expensive to try. I wouldn't recommend it.
So it's something to pay attention to. Absolutely.
Biodiversity is hugely important for us, even if it doesn't seem so right off the bat.
Well then, is all biodiversity equally threatened, or is there...
It's really... And you could probably tell this intuitively, right? Just even driving around Oahu, you can see that some forms of life are incredibly abundant, maybe too abundant. You can see minor birds wherever you go. They don't look so threatened. How far do you have to go to find an amakihi on Oahu? It's not easy. I had to hike for 3 hours a couple days ago to go find one, right? So there are these sort of, if you look at what parts of biodiversity, what species, what ecosystems are especially threatened and which ones are not, you can find common themes, right, between the ones that are doing well and the ones that are doing not. Among the ones that are really, really threatened, and this ties back to our main theme today, wetlands. So specifically freshwater ecosystems, ones that are involved with freshwater and land coming together, those ecosystems are incredibly threatened. And the species that use them are the most threatened in the world. If you compare them to the oceans and the forests, those are also very threatened, but compared to freshwater, it's a totally different ballgame.
And yet it seems like it's not getting as much attention.
Exactly, and so that's another really, really important point, is that these things provide a lot of services to us. They're in really big trouble, and almost nobody pays attention to the wetlands.
But I hear you've been doing something to help with that. You've been involved in some very important writing projects recently with the EU and the United Nations. Would you please share with us about those projects?
Yeah, of course. This has been a really exciting project for me. There's a picture we could also bring up which displays the sort of the basic title page of the work itself. But essentially, I was working in Europe for the last little over a year or so.
Spain, right?
In Spain, yeah. And I also did a bunch of traveling around to other parts.
Very good.
And I was doing a lot of this thinking and writing to people and sort of advocating about freshwater biodiversity. And I attended several conferences with a lot of very like-minded scientists and ecologists who were super knowledgeable, way more experienced than I was studying freshwater ecosystems. And we decided it would be really helpful and important for us to write a paper to the scientific community, to the conservation community, and of course to the lawmakers to emphasize this exact issue we're talking about, that these freshwater ecosystems are super important, they're super threatened, and no one's paying attention. So both the European Union and the United Nations Convention for Biological Diversity are updating their sort of recommended biodiversity strategies for the governments that are part of them. And they have to do it this year in 2020. And so we decided to write this paper and release it this year to guide that process, saying, hey, we need to pay attention to freshwater specifically. We've really been neglecting it, and now it's now or never. I mean, this is the time to do something, otherwise we're going to be losing a tremendous amount of this biodiversity and thus those services that we rely on.
I see. And how does biodiversity, how does that affect Hawaii?
Excellent, yeah. So I would say there are a lot of different ways to think about it, but if we're going to stay with this freshwater biodiversity theme, a really good place to start is the Hawaiian Aupua, that whole idea of this watershed. And there are lots of really good graphics online that kind of display this. But this is, of course, a traditional way of managing water and a traditional way of viewing the landscape, where the water would flow from the forests down through the midlands, ending up at the coastal wetlands and then out to the sea. And in that process, it was passing through all these different and unique ecosystems. It was passing through biodiversity at the habitat and environmental scale, which is tremendously important and something that we have kind of been perhaps inadvertently disrupting tremendously with the way we've been developing the island, especially since European contact. The changes that have been made have been very destructive to biodiversity, but also to all these ecosystem services that we rely on. So there was a very good study by the Maunalua watershed group where they were interviewing people and talking to the community about, well, what are the issues you're worried about? And they made this beautiful poster on the issues that actually shows, the things that people are concerned about, the problems we're experiencing in the environment in Maunalua, and these are all ecosystem service related issues. These are all things having to do with the fact that the Aupua, that system, that habitat diversity has been reduced. And now we're worried about, can we eat the fish we're catching out of the harbor? Well, maybe not, because, the water is not getting cleaned before it comes into the ocean because the wetlands aren't there. Or, oh my gosh, flooding is really scary. Well, flooding's happening more because the upland forests are not healthy and they're not maintaining a soil layer that can absorb the water when it falls and slow its exit on the landscape. So restoring native biodiversity, restoring native ecosystems is a way that we can bring back those services that are not only going to make us, feel safer on the landscape, but they're also going to save us millions of dollars. I mean, the projects you need to accomplish these services without these ecosystems are enormously expensive, and you have to do them over and over again. But these natural systems, once you get them going, of course, can just self-sustain, and that's of course what we're shooting for.
I see. So, for example, if you mentioned changes that we've done, what are some of those man-made changes?
So those would be things like, well, especially the deforestation that was occurring, or I would want to say early 20th century and throughout the 19th century. The removal of the native tree species, which then resulted in a reduction of biodiversity. So we went from having these very diverse native forests with a whole bunch of different kind of trees that were all doing different things, having different heights in the canopy, supporting different insects and you name it, and contributing in different ways to the soil health and soil quality. And then all of a sudden, we removed all that for various reasons, either physically or by allowing invasive trees to come in and replace that biodiversity. And suddenly we have this massive simplification where if you go up into the mid-level forests, maybe you'll see 2 types of trees, maybe one, right? It's just Kiave all the way up, who knows? And when you only have one species doing one thing, you lose those functions. And so suddenly those simplified forests are not performing the tasks we need them to. They're not operating on the landscape in a way that's as helpful to us. So that's one good example of a change.
Yeah. It sounds like everyone needs to pitch in. What could our viewers do to help?
I think there are a lot of things. Certainly getting involved with groups like the Hui and volunteer efforts are tremendous. And there are, of course, lots of different ways to volunteer, right? And so some people really like getting their hands dirty, so going and pulling invasive weeds from somewhere. That's fantastic. Other people don't like to do that, but they might be good at web design or something, right? If you have your own gifts and skills, you can put those towards these efforts. And it's just a matter of finding the groups that are doing the work, I think. And it's especially having worked with the Hui now for several years, it is incredible how much I see getting accomplished with volunteer efforts. And I think that is one of the most powerful ways that anybody can go in and make a difference. And then beyond that, of course, being active politically and socially, talking to other people in your community, raising the important questions, thinking about these things when you vote for somebody, right? Well, are they going to? What are their stances on these issues of biodiversity, of ecosystems and their health, and how they're going to affect us? Making informed decisions that way, making sure and if you don't, asking how candidates and things like that are going to approach these issues, I think is tremendously important.
Okay. Maybe you could explain some experiences you've had. I know you did quite a bit of work here in Hawaii, and we have differences even in the wetlands that are here.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? How do they vary?
My goodness, the better question might be how do they? Yeah, I mean, the amount of variation you observe just on Oahu is absolutely incredible, and I think it has a lot to do with different histories of these wetlands, their placement on the landscape, how intensely or not they've been invaded by introduced species, and also how they're managed. I brought along a couple pictures from a couple different wetlands that I visited, and we can talk about each one of those sort of in turn. So this one here is James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge, which was formerly a sugarcane plantation area way back, and so they had all these ponds left over from the leftover irrigation water and things like that, and they had this whole management system, and the U.S. government ended up acquiring it in the end and taking advantage of those ponds and all of the upwelling of the spring water from the mountains to maintain these and slowly grow these beautiful artificial wetland habitats for endangered water birds.
So originally was not a wetland.
I think it might have been a wetland prior to, I believe so, but that goes further back than my history gets me. But if you look, for example, at soil evidence and the topography of that area, I think prior to European contact, I would imagine that was probably Lo'i and things like that.
There were a lot more wetlands than weren't
absolutely, there. Absolutely. Even, I think there were a lot to begin with. And then, of course, when the native Hawaiians arrived and then started building Lo'i, there were even more. And then I think it's been gradually sort of reduced from there. But James Campbell is an absolutely beautiful place to work. And it was, speaking of biodiversity, because it's specifically managed for native species, there's an incredible diversity of plants there. And you can see this. You could see in the image that there's all these different patches of different kinds of wetland plants, and I think it provides really diverse food resources for the water birds, great nesting habitat, and all sorts of things. So it's really a beautiful place to be. And it's really interesting. Another place that I worked, which is another image of mine. This is Ka'elepulu wetland in Kailua, which is a really, really important habitat, especially for the Alaiula. There are tons of it over there. Yeah. But it's a very, very different place. It doesn't have, there's no big federal support for the habitat maintenance and things like that. And of course they have they don't have as much control over the water flow and things like that, because it all has to do with where the rain's coming down and whether or not the outlet into the ocean is blocked and things like that. So they have a lot of elements that are out of their control. They also have, I think, a lot of effluent from the nearby suburbs going into the wetland and things like that. But still, they manage this patch of vegetation at the edge of the pond that has it's just overflowing with alaiula, especially. it's really an impressive place. But the water is so deep there that all the field work I was doing, you can see me there at the front of this canoe, all the field work we did was by boat, that was the only field site I had to do that on, which was really interesting.
Then do the ʻAleʻula just hang out in the fringe there where it's shallow, or they go ahead and?
Oh, in terms of the water,
Yeah.
they stay mostly on the land, and they'll just run between the patches of vegetation. And as long as they have that sort of that kind of moat of water between them and the rest of the land, they're more safe from predators. So they really enjoy that environment. It's cool. But if you look at the land there, it's almost all the same plant.
Yes.
That's Batis marittima, pickleweed, which is a really interesting, I believe also introduced wetland plant. It can grow in slightly saltier waters, but it just took over the whole thing. We don't have that same patchiness that we have, for example, at James Campbell, but the birds are still doing great. It's an interesting contrast.
Then compared to your work in Spain, what kind of differences, how are the wetlands different in Spain
Oh, for sure.
versus Hawaii?
Mm-hmm. Well, so of course, one of the major things that makes any wetland, the type of wetland that it is the hydrology. How is the water behaving? Mm-hmm. And here on the Hawaiian Islands, we have really cool hydrology. Right? We have these these big mountain ridges that are scraping water out of the sky, and it comes dumping down, and then some of it goes over the land, a bunch of it goes under the ground and comes back up. And so a lot of the wetlands here in Hawaii are permanent for the most part.
Yeah.
Especially the spring-fed ones like Keawava.
Yeah.
They're always wet, they're always there. It's a very stable habitat. In Spain, for example, the hydrology is totally different. I mean, it is a very, very dry place. So I left Spain in August, and it had not rained, I want to say, since the beginning of March, something like that.
What happens to the wetlands then?
They just shrink. They shrink. A lot of them have some spring feeding going on that can keep them going for some time. But what happens is that there's a rainy season. It's a Mediterranean climate, so it's a lot like how California sort of used to be before climate change made it just drought central. But where there are usually a few months that are very wet, and then the rest of the time it's just very pretty and sunny and dry. And so Doñana, which was the big national park I was working on, this was this massive wetland complex. They would get a bunch of water in the wintertime, and then these wetlands would just slowly shrink over the course of the summer. And so all the breeding species would be kind of having a big rush to get all the breeding done all at once, and then before the wetlands disappear, right?
Then do they migrate, or they hibernate?
Yeah, they'd be migrating. And of course, we get a lot less of that migratory behavior here on the islands because the ʻAleʻula, for example, they don't need to go anywhere. They know that wetland's going to be there tomorrow. They don't have the same pressure. They can just take it easy, which is great. It's a very different pace of life for them. But yeah, the birds in Spain, I mean, it was like they had to get there, get their wetland figured out, try to get the whole nesting thing done, and then get out before everything dries up and they're vulnerable to predators.
Was there a species in particular you were paying attention to while there?
So research-wise, I was studying actually. So the interesting thing about Spain is because it's sort of between two continents, and it's especially down where I was, which is the hottest part of Spain. During the winter time, some birds would actually come down and spend the winter there as their sort of vacation spot, but then other birds in the springtime would be coming up from somewhere else to breed there. So it was really, you kind of got a little bit of both. So I was actually studying some gulls that they nest up in the UK and maybe parts of Scandinavia and Belgium and the Netherlands, and then in the wintertime they all come down to Spain to have a nice little vacation where it's a little warmer. And so the species I was studying was the lesser blackback gull, and their populations have been skyrocketing recently, and we don't entirely know why. But one interesting thing that they do is they hang out in the national park and the wetlands a lot in the wintertime, but also they have started to go, because again, the wetlands are not necessarily doing that well, and there are a lot of reasons why, that these birds have been going outside of the national park to use other wetlands that are artificial. rice cultivation is a big thing there. And these birds are using the rice fields to find their food and to hang out and to kind of socialize while they're on their vacation. And so you'll see thousands of these birds hanging out in the rice fields and just chilling.
My goodness.
So I was doing a whole bunch of work on their behavior and why they're out there and what they're doing.
Wonderful. And then what's another interesting species? I know you've done a lot of ornithology. What's another interesting bird that you've studied?
Out in Doñana. So some of the ones that fascinate me the most are there's an endangered duck there called the malvasilla. I think in English is the white-headed duck or something like that. It's a beautiful little, well, a lot of people think they're ugly. I think they're quite cute. Little tiny, very endangered duck that's more or less endemic to that region and a bit of the Middle East. And they are having the same problem as our koloa here in Hawaii, where another bird that's very closely related got introduced, and then now they've been interbreeding and they're worried about them getting bred out of existence. The funny thing is, the way it happened is way different, because here, of course, mallards were probably just being introduced by everybody for, whatever, they have farm ducks. But over there, these North American ducks arrived by accident because there was some very fancy sort of like waterbird zoo in England. They accidentally let a bunch of them go.
Oh dear.
Because they had a hole in their fence. And now they're driving a species extinct. So, a bit of a mess.
So, biodiversity has a lot of importance. It's facing threats, but we can do something.
Absolutely. And freshwater biodiversity especially is worth highlighting as one that helps us so much that we always forget to acknowledge and that is enormously valuable.
Oh. Well, it was really nice visiting with you today, and I hope you get to come back to Hawaii soon. And I know all people of Hawaii have benefited so much from things we've learned from your studies, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
And mahalo for joining us today, and to all the folks of Ōlelo Community Studio and Livable Hawaii Kai Hui for arranging this monthly community show. Thank you.